Now entering Nerdist.com.
Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast, Episode 12, The Menagerie.
Welcome, members of the Tribunal, to another episode of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm Ken Ray.
And I'm John Champion. You are listening to the show that has a singular mission: to seek out the meanings and messages of every episode of Star Trek, and we mean every one, to find out what still holds water in this 21st century world.
Today, meet the crew of the Enterprise. Again. For the first time. Again. For the first time. Again. Today we're looking at Star Trek's only two-parter for the original series, and we're doing it in just one podcast episode. Spock freaks out and steals the Enterprise to take his old captain, Christopher Pike, to Starfleet's one and only forbidden planet, Talos 4. This is the Menagerie.
Didn't we already meet the crew of the Enterprise again for the first time again?
For the first time again. Yeah, a few times. It's, I was thinking before we started this episode that what we should do is just record 10 minutes at the beginning, 5 minutes at the end, and just edit in episode 1 of the Mission Log into episode 12 of the Mission Log, because that's kind of, I applaud the whole, reduce, reuse, recycle thing, but if you've seen The Cage, you've seen half of both of these episodes.
That's very true. Yeah. So I guess it's a little bit of foreshadowing to our audience is that we're going to try to stay away from a lot of the specifics about The Cage, because we figure that the best thing that you can do is go back to episode 1 of the podcast, which is essentially going to be episode 0 of Star Trek, and watch The Cage, listen to our podcast about The Cage. Then you'll understand what that show is really all about. Then you can kind of come back to us, and we're going to talk about the different aspects of the Menagerie. What makes that one unique?
I feel like we should send out a pamphlet with this episode.
should it be a flow chart? Listen to this part, then go back
with instructions, right, on how to do it. Hey, before you get started though on the multi-pronged, offensive that is, and right. not offensive. Not offensive in a bad way.
Do you find me offensive?
More like doing your thing. Before you get started doing your thing with this episode, we do want to remind everyone that we do want to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook and on Twitter. Mission Log Pod is our name on Twitter. Or you can leave us a message via Skype at Mission Log Pod, or by calling us, just like Grandpa used to do. Not your grandpa, I don't think he ever called us. 323-522-5641. That number again, 323-522-5641. Your comments may be used on a future edition of Mission Log. And there's a website, John.
Oh, yes, missionlogpodcast.com, which is part of the Roddenberry.com vast array of podcasts. And I have to say, the site gets cooler and cooler looking every time I check it out.
So, you've got this thing that you do, and I love it. It's one of the things I love about you. Where you comb the depths, or maybe you just go online, or maybe you ask a dude, I don't know. But you come up with trivia for every episode. Please tell me you have not let me down, and that there is trivia for the Menagerie.
If there's one thing in life that keeps me going, Ken, it's a desire to not let you down.
Thank you.
And I do. I comb the internet. I also go to a handful of books that are excellent sources about Star Trek. And every now and then we dip into the Roddenberry archives to get the nitty-gritty, the lowdown on Star Trek trivia. So the first and most important thing to understand about the Menagerie Parts 1 and 2, and we are covering Parts 1 and 2 in this single podcast, is that the episodes, the combination of episodes, was created to fill a gap in the writing schedule. They had already produced 15 or so shows here about mid-season or mid-production cycle, and they realized, hey, we are running out of scripts. We need to do something quick. And Gene Roddenberry, being as industrious as he was, the whole reduce, reuse, recycle thing, decided, we can take The Cage, which has never been seen before, chop up its pieces, and stretch that out into a two-parter. Now, the wraparound, all of the courtroom intrigue that we'll get into with our story description, was originally written by John D.F. Black, and he has sort of a rocky history with Star Trek. He was around from the beginning, but the script that he turned in, well, nobody liked it, or at least Gene Roddenberry didn't like it, and he completely and utterly rewrote it, just started from scratch. Now, Black actually complained to the Writers Guild, but he lost because this was a new script. Black would show up again every now and then. He actually worked on a couple episodes of the first season of Next Generation. But he is one of those figures, one of those names you don't hear often, at least not as often as, say, Gene Roddenberry, Robert Justman, when you're talking about the early creation of Star Trek. Now, here's an interesting bit of trivia. This was actually not the first time that Gene had considered reusing the cage. Would it blow your mind completely if I told you he thought about shooting new footage, like showing the crash of the Columbia, and releasing this theatrically?
That's kind of a neat idea.
It is.
It's a weird idea.
Yeah. I
mean, because it would still be, unless it took a very, very, very long time to crash the Columbia,
right.
It would have been a short movie.
Yeah, well, I think there would have been other scenes cut in as well. The issue was that they couldn't get Jeffrey Hunter back because by the time he had finished with Star Trek, and of course he passed away much, much too early in 1969.
Yeah.
But at that time, he was a rising star, and the cost and the difficulty of getting him back would have been too much. But hey, you filmed the crash of the Columbia, you maybe put Toulousians at home hanging out, and then you can stretch out this episode into a full-length feature. But the question then would have been, well, when do you release it? Did he had in mind releasing it before Star Trek went on the air? Or do you do like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and you release it during summer hiatus? And you just hope that people kind of put together the timeline on their own.
Well, it could just be another... Well, I guess it couldn't just be another adventure because it does take place on the Enterprise.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
So it's not like the whole thing they did with Battlestar Galactica where it's like, oh, and here's this other thing that was happening during the Second Cylon War.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Huh.
Couple other points. This episode actually has 2 director credits. So Mark Daniels directed The Menagerie, Robert Butler directed The Cage, and they are given single credits for parts 1 and 2 of The Menagerie, respectively. Sean Kinney here steps in the Christopher Pike role because Jeffrey Hunter, like I said, they couldn't get him, or they wouldn't be able to get him for this one. And this was actually produced right after another episode of Star Trek called Court Martial. But it's a good thing they didn't run in order because Star Trek would have just become its own Law and Order series at that point. It would have been all courtroom drama all the time. They're just on a spaceship. So.
Such a great idea. That's such a great idea. And they could have like Raymond Burr guest every now and then. It was Perry Mason, right? And, and for the defense... Oh, no, for the prosecution, I guess it was Ham. What was his name? Never mind. Sorry, yeah. I'm being bad. I shouldn't do that. You know what we should do instead?
What's that?
Let's not talk about Perry Mason, for crying out loud. Let's talk about The Menagerie.
Just for listening today, you get not 1, not 2, but 3 episodes of Star Trek in one. Now how much would you pay, and would your cost be as high as the toll that might be exacted from Spock?
Prologue. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beam down to Starbase 11. Everyone there is glad to see him, but nobody knows why they came. Kirk says Spock says they got a message from former Enterprise Captain Christopher Pike, but Commodore Mendez, commander of Starbase 11, says that's impossible. Pike was exposed to mega amounts of radiation, saving a bunch of cadets. He cannot move much. He cannot talk at all. Save for blinking light messages, 1 for yes, 2 for no. Thus, he could not have sent the message. Pike refuses to see the 3 men, though he does agree to see his former science officer, Mr. Spock. Spock tells Pike that he'll commit both mutiny and treason to take Pike somewhere that's only 6 days away. Pike beeps and blinks no, but Spock seems determined as we head to the opening credits. Act 1. Kirk is stymied. He insists on going over every record Starbase 11 has, since if Spock says they got a message, they must have. Mendez tasks Computer Central with checking and rechecking, since if Spock says it's good enough for Kirk, it's almost good enough for Mendez. Don't try to figure that sentence out, you'll hurt yourself. The checking and rechecking gives Spock time to get into Computer Central, where he's able to send fake messages to the Enterprise, including new flight instructions that will leave the Enterprise controlled by the computer. The whole time, Pike is blinking no. Kirk begins to wonder whether Spock is up to something. Maybe there was no message, though Bones says that's nuts. First of all, Spock's a Vulcan, and second, Spock is Spock. No way he lied. Still trying to get to the bottom of things, Kirk is given a super top-secret briefing on Talos 4, a planet off-limits to anyone in a big way, though one once visited by the Enterprise when it was commanded by Pike, with Spock as science officer. Then a shock. Make that two of them. The practically immobile Pike has disappeared, and the Enterprise has warped out of orbit without Kirk. Act 2. Away from Starbase 11, Spock orders radio silence. He also pays no heed to the small ship that's chasing the Enterprise. Bones is confused by the goings-on, though Spock plays him a fake message of Kirk saying, "It's all good." Meanwhile, the craft pursuing the Enterprise loses power. Turns out it's a shuttlecraft carrying Kirk and Mendez. Spock brings it aboard, then turns himself over to Bones to be detained. The charge is mutiny, Doctor. This does, however, not return control of the ship to the people, and onward they press to Talos 4. Act 3. With time to kill, they decide to convene a hearing on Mr. Spock's actions. Spock insists that it be a court-martial instead, with Kirk, Mendez, and Pike sitting in judgment. And it's a serious trial, as Spock will be killed if they make it to Talos 4. Going there is the only crime in the Federation for which there is still a death penalty. Mendez demands as part of the court-martial to know why Spock has done what he's done. This allows Spock to make public all of the goings-on around the first trip to Talos 4. And so, everybody starts watching The Cage. Mendez wants to know how they have such great recordings, since such recordings are not normally made. Spock won't tell him, but Pike confirms, one blink yes, the recordings are legit. Act 4. We watch Kirk watch Spock smile at plants on Talos 4. We also learn that the evidence being presented is being broadcast from Talos 4. Act 5. The court-martial continues. Mendez again wants the whole thing to stop, as even communication with Talos 4 is verboten. Never mind going there. Spock says they have no choice. They are now under control of the Keeper. And so we spend the bulk of Part 2 of the Menagerie watching the rest of The Cage. We learn of the Talosian trick of mind control. We see Pike refight his fight on Rigel. We see him gain feelings for Vina, to the point that Kirk thinks Pike's resolve was weakening all those years ago. Along the way, we also learn that the Talosians care about Pike. At the end of Act 7, the Talosians stop broadcasting the recordings to the Enterprise, and Kirk, Mendez, and Pike find Spock guilty. Act 8. With the Enterprise in orbit around Talos 4, the broadcasts resume. We watch the end of The Cage with the crew of the Enterprise, with one major omission. A healthy-looking Vina returns to the underground lair of the Talosians alone. Having seen the whole show, Kirk begins to argue for leniency for Spock to Mendez, who disappears before his eyes. He was an illusion the whole time, projected by the Talosians. They say Kirk's strength of will would have allowed him to regain control of the Enterprise at some point, and so the diversion of the court-martial. Kirk says Spock should have told him, but Spock says one person facing the death penalty was plenty, thank you very much. Meanwhile, the real Mendez on Starbase 11 has seen the Talosian TV show. No punishment will be doled upon Spock. It's up to Kirk and Pike what to do at this point. Pike decides to live on Talos 4. And here's the money shot from The Cage repurposed. The healthy-looking Vina and the healthy-looking Pike go underground to live happily ever after. The end.
I think that is one of the coolest reuses of footage in this whole thing.
It is, and I know that I watched the Menagerie a long time ago. Somewhere it stuck with me that I don't know if I was figuring it out or if I was remembering it, but I was like, oh, I know what they're going to do. He's going to get back there. I got to say, though, I once again, and I know we're not going to talk a whole lot about The Cage because we talked a whole lot about The Cage several weeks ago.
Right.
I think the Talosians might be underselling themselves.
How do you think?
I think they might be selling themselves a tiny bit short because they are able somehow. Okay, so Kirk and Spock and Bones are on Starbase 11, which is really more a planet than a starbase, but we can talk about that another time if you want to. They're there, and they're there with the real Mendez. And then somewhere along the way, the Talosians are able to replace the real Mendez with the projection of Mendez, which is on the shuttlecraft. and then is on the Enterprise, and they're able to maintain that, idea in everybody's minds all the way across, like 6 days at warp whatever. I think it was warp 7. I can't remember. 6 days at warp whatever, they're able to do that. Seriously, they couldn't get food delivered?
Well, you know what? It's funny that you should mention that, because one of our listeners, Will, wrote in before we recorded this episode saying, when exactly was Commodore Mendez replaced? Because it kind of throws things off depending on how you look at this. If he was replaced on Starbase 11, well, that means that the Talosians have a huge reach.
Yeah.
Their mental powers go. And if that is the case, why would you have a starbase that close to Talos 4? That seems like bad planning.
Unless it's to keep people away from Talos 4.
Maybe that was their whole job. Couldn't they then be affected by what's going on with the Talosians? The Talosians could take that over at any point and mess with them with their high-end illusions.
Well, are we even sure there's a Starbase 11 now that you mention it?
Oh, great. All right. Now we're in the Matrix.
If we assume though that there is a Starbase 11,
just completely blew my mind.
Well, sorry, dude. It's part of what I do. If we assume though that there is a Starbase 11, I know exactly when he was replaced.
Okay.
Commodore, it's a long trip. I want to make sure before we leave that we're not going to have to pull over. So if you need to, and then there's your perfect opportunity.
I think you're right. Couple of things I'll point out in the story. And by the way, I watched the Blu-ray remaster, so TOS remastered, for those of you in the know. When they first beamed down to Starbase 11, that's Mike and Denise Okuda standing to the left of your screen having a conversation. I thought that was really cool, that they got to work themselves into original series Star Trek, because they've been working on Trek since Next Generation, and they're kind of the historians, the keepers of all that is Trek in terms of being like a source of reference for the shows. So I thought that was really cool that they worked in extra people and they got to work in themselves in that shot. Now, did you notice the same thing, or did you do the same thing that I did, which is when the Commodore opens up the confidential Your Eyes Only book about Talos 4, I freeze-framed on that. I wanted to read every single word of it.
I absolutely did not do that.
Okay, well, here's the thing that jumped out at me. I'll spoil it for you.
Okay.
So you get the bare bones. The Enterprise was the only ship to visit Talos 4. Mm-hmm. And then it says on there twice, Captain Christopher Pike and half Vulcan science officer Spock. So it says that in the description, and then at the very end, Captain Christopher Pike and half Vulcan science officer Spock. And I thought, really? How? That's just how we describe people in official reports. Is we just immediately make sure we make a note of their race. That seems a little odd.
Yes. Well, the return trip to Talos 4, the documentation on that will say, and 1/8 Cherokee Captain.
Right.
Captain, right. I lost his name because I'm still trying to figure out what do we say.
Yeah.
Sorry, Captain Kirk. 1/8. Yeah, 1/8 Cherokee Captain Kirk, and there's also 1/64 Irish.
Yeah, you're right.
It becomes like a family tree. It's like every report's like 28 pages, although 23 of those are just everybody's lineage.
Yeah. We're going to take a blood sample and we're going to give you a whole DNA history on every single crew member. That'll be how we track people from now on.
I'm sorry. That's awesome.
So, hey, we get to see a shuttlecraft now,
yes.
Even though this episode was filmed a little later. So the shuttlecraft had made an appearance production-wise before this, but now we finally get to see one. And they changed the name on that shuttle when it's coming from Starbase 11 for the remastered edition.
Okay.
So they had used the Galileo in the original production of this, but they went back and they used the Picasso. They gave it a new name and a new registration number. So now we get to see the shuttle. We would have seen it if things were running in production order, but now we get to see it again for the first time again.
For the first time. It makes no sense that the Enterprise's shuttlecraft would have been down there, because Spock, Bones, and McCoy beamed down.
Right.
What, do they send the shuttlecraft just in case?
Exactly.
So it makes sense that it would be the Starbase 11 shuttlecraft.
And, just from a kind of the point of view that we have is very unique because we watched The Cage first, and now that Star Trek is behind us in terms of being produced and aired, and everybody knows about The Cage, I thought it was really cool to revisit that episode and notice all the differences again of The Cage, the pilot, and then Star Trek we know and love, because there's a real palpable difference in that earnestness of Captain Pike's crew. Yeah. And the kind of more relaxed approach that we get with Kirk and with his crew. The pacing feels very different. But then the thing that I thought is that if you were a TV viewer in 1966 and this episode aired and you didn't know anything about the production history of Star Trek and you knew nothing about The Cage, this had the potential to absolutely blow your mind.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes and no. I mean, not as much as for the people who saw it for the first time. See, that's weird because we talk about, Gene Roddenberry used to show this, when he was traveling, and then it was aired for the first time in, what was it, 87 or 88 on television? Right. But when Gene was traveling around, he maybe hit a couple of conventions, but I don't think it really picked up steam until the 70s. But I mean, he was out showing. But it was actually almost completely shown. There are very few parts. I mean, with us having just watched it a few weeks ago for this show, there are very few parts that are missing. We don't get Yeoman Colt being as ditzy on the bridge. Right. At the beginning and at the end of the episode. Those two things we don't get. And of course, I mean, they do screw with the continuity as far as in the episode The Cage. Christopher Pike actually watches the healthy Vina and the healthy Christopher Pike go down below the surface of Talos 4. So he knows that she's going to be happy because she's in love with him, and he's actually okay with, this image of him going down there to live forever with her because he did have feelings for her, and, he wants her to be okay and wants her to be happy. Yeah. I mean, aside from those three things, though, I mean, it's practically the entire episode. We get the whole thing with number one. We don't get the part about him saying, I'm not used to having a woman on the bridge. Well, you understand, number one, it's not the same. Right. But we do still get Spock going, the women, which is still just a fantastic line. It's great to see that again. It was weird to me, though. I will say this. It was weird to me that they left the part with Spock smiling about the plants making noise. Yeah, I thought that was a little odd, too, because it's really out of place. Well, I mean, it's neat that it shows how different alien worlds can be. Right. I mean, that is a neat part of it. But then Spock smiling at that, it just seemed like, Yeah. Apparently. Well, which is strange because you have a line in there. McCoy keeps making a case for Spock being incapable of lying and having repressed his emotions so far that the human side is practically gone. Cut to a giggly Spock holding blue leaves. He's not giggly. Well, he's awfully smiley about it. He is very smiley about it. Yeah, blue leaves make him happy. But here's the thing. So, put yourself in the position of a Star Trek fan in 1966, and you've watched 10 episodes of this so far, and starting with the man trap, and then you're hit with this, and you go, wow, imagining that you knew nothing about The Cage up until this point, and you go, wow, this show just showed me its entire alternate origin story. We're going back 13 years. We're seeing this captain we never heard of before. And I think that is a really cool kind of daring way to do TV that really you only see now. Yeah. When long-running show, Doctor Who will do this kind of thing every now and then where they'll do a story and just not even have the Doctor in it at all. Yeah. They'll just have other people talking about him or reacting to him or to what he has done. And I think that's a really daring way to make TV. And this must have felt incredibly daring at the time. Now, the average TV viewer didn't know, they've been sitting on this pilot for a couple of years. It didn't sell. And, we have to make do. We've got to use it somehow. Yeah. But just to see it and go, oh, wow, this Star Trek thing that I like has this rich history now. Of other characters and other ships and other missions. I just think that's a really neat thing. It is a really neat thing. having not been there, we should maybe we should talk to somebody who actually, was a gigantic fan from the time that the show was first on, because I wonder how that did register or resonate with people.
I agree. Yeah. And that fan can call us at 323-522-5641 and let us know. One last thing before we get into our topical discussion. Kirk takes a shuttlecraft from Starbase 11. He may or may not have the real Commodore Mendez on board, okay, because we don't know when he got replaced with the Telosian illusion. And he pushes himself to the point of no return. He doesn't have enough fuel to get back to Starbase 11, and yet he doesn't know if the Enterprise is going to turn around and rescue him.
Right.
Now, theoretically, the Telosians have been at least aware of, if not in control of what is going on here.
Right.
So if Spock had not made the decision to turn around and retrieve Kirk, would the Telosians have just let him die?
Spock wouldn't have made that decision.
Well, we hope not. It seems like he hesitated a little.
Well, I mean, let's back up a little bit. I don't know that the Telosians actually have the power to save him. I mean, I think the best the Telosians could do is make Kirk think he wasn't dead, until he actually was. Right. Because we've sort of established when we talked about the cage that they can't just blink things into existence. I mean, it's still unclear whether Vina was ever actually with Pike the whole time. We still don't know. I mean, until the very end, actually, of the Menagerie. We believe that they're both together, but who knows? I mean, that's their skill at mind bleepery, as we talked about so many weeks ago, is fairly stunning. That said, I don't think they would have been able to save Kirk had Spock not turned around. Now, one would hope that what the Telosians would have done was really gotten on Spock's case and said, dude, seriously, you can't leave him there to die. But, I mean, that's how they might have saved him. But, I mean, Spock's never going to let Kirk die.
Yeah.
That's just not going to happen.
All right. Just wanted to make sure.
It's fun to watch Star Trek with the characters from Star Trek, but did we all see the same thing in the episode?
So if there's one thing that we all know, it is that Vulcans are completely logical. They have no emotion. They got nothing. Now, granted, it is stated all over Starfleet. It's probably written on the bathroom walls at Starfleet Command that Spock is only half Vulcan. Mm-hmm. Because apparently that was the kind of thing that mattered to people in the 23rd century. But we do in this episode get to see Spock at what could be his most compassionate. It raises an interesting question, though. This whole episode, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, is about loyalty. And so I guess if we're talking about Spock, is his sense of loyalty misplaced here?
And for that matter, you have to ask that question again of Kirk, certainly.
Yep.
Of McCoy to an extent. Mm-hmm. It's really tough because I think this is one of those episodes where you're balancing out the reality of dramatic production. How do we move the story along? How do we get out the exposition that we need to get out? And then how do we also stay true to the characters? Mm-hmm. And how do we make those play out in a richly emotional and logical way? And I kept feeling like I was being toyed with in this episode, where I already have established that Kirk, McCoy, and Spock are heroes. Mm-hmm. They're the people that we look up to, the people we kind of aspire for the best part of ourselves to be like.
Right.
But part of that is putting yourself in that same situation and saying, what would I do and who would I trust and how much am I willing to potentially break the law for my friend just on a hunch that my friend is right. And Spock has done every single thing that he could to stack the deck against him. He has tampered with records, he has sent false communications, he has kidnapped a person, and he has stolen a ship. It does not get worse than that, Except he has also stacked the whole court-martial thing. I mean, the reason they're having the court-martial as opposed to the hearing is because the court-martial demands that everything be entered into the record and that things move in a certain order. They move with a certain speed. Had they just had a hearing, well, that might have just wasted a little time, but then they would have tossed him into the brig or put him back under arrest in his quarters until they could convene a true court-martial.
And that would have ruined the whole, the whole timing thing of him being able to get the whole thing made public. I mean, he stacked the deck against himself, but he's also at the same time made sure that everything that he needs to be heard will be heard. I mean, he even jockeys Mendez into position, gets him to ask him for stuff that is going to require that he tell him everything. But this is where that gets confusing, though, when it turns out later that Mendez is just a Talosian projection.
Right. Well, that's the tough part about it because, Spock is obviously trying to use logic, and he just happened to get very lucky. Maybe he got lucky, or maybe he knew that Mendez was a projection. That's a good question. Does Spock know that this Mendez is fake Mendez, is Talosian Mendez? Because he does, as you say, he jockeyed Mendez into this position to ask him why. Why are you doing this? Therefore, he gets to show the whole story. But this raises another question. Was Spock somehow in contact with the Talosians before all of this, secretly, to know that this projection would be coming from Talos to show the story during the course of this court-martial trial? Well,
we know that Spock was in contact with the Talosians beforehand because the Talosians say that the whole reason that they have the court-martial is to distract Kirk.
Distract Kirk, yeah.
The Talosians say that Spock informed them of Kirk's force of will, so Kirk would have been able to figure out how to get control of the Enterprise again. And so what they did instead was they dummy up this whole court-martial idea so that Kirk is distracted by that.
Yeah.
Rather than, distracted by how do I regain control of my ship, which the Talosians, after Spock convinces them, Talosians are fairly convinced that Kirk would be able to do that. So we need something really big, like maybe the death of his first officer to distract him. It has to be big.
So then this leads me kind of to this line that McCoy has. He says to Kirk, basically, I'm paraphrasing, it would be understandable for you or I to go off half-cocked, given the right circumstances, but it would be impossible for Spock. But clearly it is totally possible for Spock, and Spock has taken this to an extreme, to a huge extreme, because you have to wonder, is this the kind of thing that McCoy would do, given his loyalty to Kirk or anybody else who are his friends, his compatriots on the ship? Is it something that Kirk would do?
You're going to make me say something borderline dirty. No, you are. I mean, because here's the thing. Spock is not going off half-cocked.
Mm-hmm.
He's going off... see, I don't want to say it full cocked. Okay, or completely.
Yeah.
I mean, he's figured all of this out. He knows exactly what he's doing. McCoy is right. McCoy might be the kind of guy who would just, this isn't working, I'm going to take over the ship. Or Kirk might do that as well. But Spock really put a lot of thought into this. I mean, every part of this has been, even if we decide that it was a completely illogical thing for Spock to have done and a completely illogical course of action for Spock to have taken, he's very logical, or at the very least methodical, about how he's doing it. There is no part of this that's been left to chance, especially if he knew about fake Mendez. Now, if he didn't know about fake Mendez, then maybe he just figured, ship's going to be under computer control anyway. Whatever. Let's go.
Right.
I guess the one thing he left to chance was when he broke into Computer Central. Somebody might have pulled a phaser.
Yeah.
That's the one thing that he didn't know.
Yeah, true. Well, again, this is one of those moments on the mission log where we have to say, well, we can only review and discuss what we are given for sure. Mm-hmm. We can't really speculate on what didn't happen, if you were to put it that way. And but these questions kind of do come up, and you have to say, well, okay, Starfleet has the death penalty on this. So Spock is just totally running with the idea that he is putting himself and other crew members here in the position of potentially facing the death penalty. Right. But you have to wonder, what would the repercussions ever be if from the beginning Starfleet had just treated this as an open book case? Again, the reality is we're making a TV show here, and we have to get the drama up on screen.
Right.
Okay. But then the question that I hate to speculate about, because we're not given that on screen, is, well, if from the very beginning we had just said Talos 4 is a place that is forbidden by Starfleet, but we're going to tell you why. We're not going to make it a secret. We're going to tell you why this is, and you run a huge risk of being there, so just don't go there. But instead, we do all this kind of cloak and dagger stuff, and we make it the death penalty. I feel like the death penalty is overreaching a little bit.
Remember, though, the Talosians said that if humanity had extended contact with Talos 4, that they would eventually learn the secret of mind control, and that would eventually destroy their civilization. Now, it may take a while.
Yeah.
But I mean, the death penalty did seem a little excessive. At the same time, I don't think you can leave it like an open thing, because as we talked about before, if mind control like this is something that somebody else can learn, it's just like going back to Miri. So there's this horrible contagion that if the Romulans had stumbled across it, or if the Klingons had stumbled across it, or if just some ne'er-do-well like Harry Mudd had stumbled across it. Now, Harry Mudd doesn't have the patience, I don't think. Right. To really learn the mind control of Talos 4. But the Romulans and the Klingons got nothing but time. So, I mean, making it completely off limits and not saying why may actually make sense. It was surprising to hear, though, that it was a death penalty offense.
Yeah, it still doesn't prevent anybody else from going there, which, could be trouble down the road. And hey, you know what? Here's the thing. Because on an individual basis, maybe it's not such a bad thing. If you want to walk right into this trap, then go right ahead. You can just step right into this trap that's waiting for you. But we're not going to send anybody from Starfleet to rescue you and bring you back, because it is too dangerous. You know what I'm thinking? Here's a new place to move all of those prisoners from the Tantalus colony and Dagger of the Mind.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. You know what I was thinking? I was thinking that Talos 4 missed a bet by not opening itself up as a retirement community.
Right.
Because nobody wants to sit around and, well, I guess some people do want to sit around and watch TV in their later years, but I assume that a lot of people do that because they don't really have the get up and go, literally and figuratively, to climb mountains or sail the seas. But relax. Enjoy a leisurely retirement on Talos 4, where you can do whatever the heck you want. And then, and then the Federation would probably be more than happy to keep bringing them food and machines and all the stuff they might ever need if they go ahead and take care of their tired and elderly.
Well, so I'm glad that you brought that up, though, because, I mean, we're kind of saying that in a joking way, but the one thing that I was thinking in a serious way about this is that, all right, we have something that is very serious going on here, and that is that Pike has been disabled almost beyond any function. He can answer yes or no, and he can move
a tiny bit.
Yeah, just a tiny, tiny bit.
Right.
But he can't do anything else. And in reality, we have people around us, everywhere in the world, who are invalids, who are severely disabled, who have, some just purely from a psychological or a mental process are shut out, right. As they say, who cannot converse or interact. And I wondered, as I was watching this, I was thinking, well, even more realistically, we have a certain obligation as human beings to these other human beings who are facing that. If we were to get to a point where you could do this, where you can use sort of, obviously not a Talosian sort of telekinetic or telepathic version of projecting this, but let's say you can hook up a brain to an electronic simulation.
Oh, and suddenly this sounds like a good idea to you? Oh, when I'm signing with Dr. Roger Corby...
I knew it would come to that.
Well, how can it not? I mean, you're all like, oh, this is a terrible thing. Would you want to do this? It's a slippery slope, my friend.
Well, I still think that, though. I'm really torn. I'm really torn about it because I do wonder, again, if you present this false reality, whether you want it or not, and you have to assume that people who are shut out like this, who are maybe not asking for that procedure, that process. Is it right? Is it valid to do that just because we can, because we on the outside think it's better? And that leads me to this other question that I have here. We see a very different Christopher Pike in The Cage than we do in The Menagerie. And I don't just mean physically. I mean that the Pike in The Cage fights tooth and nail against this idea of being captive, even if it is benevolent captivity, as the Talosians say. Mm-hmm. And he says, we would rather die than be in a cage. But now the circumstances changed. So the extenuating circumstance now is that he has been a horrible accident. He's confined to a wheelchair. He cannot communicate at all. So do our circumstances affect so greatly our judgment now about what is right and wrong?
Well, what is right and wrong for us individually? I mean, I don't think Pike would ever say, you know what would be great is if we just captured a bunch of people and shoved them into this cage. But, I mean, you have this weird sort of paradox in this episode where this thing that he saw as a cage in, 13 years earlier is now really a gateway to a kind of freedom that he can no longer experience in the, quote, real world, end quote.
But Pike keeps saying no, 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 no to all of happening.
I assume, though, that was because he didn't want Spock to risk his own life. They didn't want Spock to risk the Enterprise and risk, because Spock ends up risking Kirk's career as well as his own life and certainly his own career. So my assumption was that Pike was being a bit altruistic there and saying, no, I don't want this for you. Although we don't really know because all we get is yes and no from him. And mostly we get no throughout the entire episode. Now, the other question is if they had asked, because if he had been able to divorce himself from that idea, and we don't really know because it's not made clear, was he against the idea of going to Talos 4, and did he then change his mind because he was reminded of the feelings that he did have for Vina while he was there? And by the way, Vina was old when they got there. Vina was an adult when the Columbia crashed on Talos 4. It has been 18 years, so Vina is a bit older than Pike at that point. It has now been 13 years since the last time we were on Talos 4. Do we even know that Vina is still there, or are they now projecting for Pike the idea that he and Vina live happily ever after, where she's actually gone on to her great reward maybe 5 or 10 years ago?
That is an excellent question.
It is the Matrix. You were right. It is a different version of the Matrix.
And then the question becomes, well, what do the Talosians get out of it? Because
TV, dude, TV. Are you kidding me? This has been, honestly, I got to figure that the Menagerie has been the best miniseries the Talosians have seen, probably since the Enterprise last left. I mean, this has got to be what the Talosians get out of it is a whole new programming director.
Remember, the Talosians wanted more than that, though. They took the humans up to the surface to say, well, we also need you for our machinery, our agriculture, to build a civilization. Okay. And Pike is in no position to do that.
But you're forgetting the I hate to use the word altruism again just because I've already used it once. But I mean,
use it again. Go ahead.
Okay, you're forgetting the sort of altruistic nature of the Talosians at the end of the episode when they realize how much humans hate to be in a cage, even if it's a good cage. I mean, when they realize that putting them in the cage is sort of against their will, they'd rather kill themselves and anybody else around them than be, a slave, basically. Then they decide, okay, well, we can't use humans, and the problem is you guys were the best, so we're just going to die now. So I think the Talosians have made peace with, with the fact that their race is not long for the universe.
Yeah.
So I think, they're just looking for something good to watch while they wait out their days.
Right. Wow. Well, it will go a long way for some good entertainment.
Are there messages and morals in the episode we watched, or were they all in the episode that Kirk watched? And, whichever episode they were in, do they stand up today?
So at the end of every mission log, we like to present some questions to each other to see what we got out of the episode. So the first thing I'll ask you, Ken, is does this show, as a piece of entertainment, as a production, does it hold up?
Really tough question, honestly. I mean, if you've been watching it the way we've been watching it, it might be a little soon. You know, I might actually suggest that people, if they weren't doing this along with us, maybe hold this till next season. Maybe watch the rest of season 1 and then come back. Because while I don't think it's bad, and while it is neat and potentially mind-blowing, as you say, that, people are getting this whole new look at Star Trek in the middle of Star Trek, that's kind of fun. And so, and that way it kind of holds up. At the same time, there are too many, there are a lot of logic problems here. I know that what Spock did was, loyalty for Pike, and that everything ended up being okay. But really, Spock needs to be drummed out of Starfleet because he really just kind of took far too much on himself. Now, that said, that doesn't jibe with the message. I mean, if we're talking about loyalty, if we're talking about, respect for people, if we're talking about, doing your best for people around you, then it wouldn't really work out to say, okay, but seriously, you're out of Starfleet. So, I mean, if you try to look at it logically, which of course you want to do because you're talking about a Vulcan, for crying out loud. If you try to look at it logically, it doesn't really work. But if you just want to look at it as, an examination of loyalty, an examination of character, certainly, because we do get a lot more about Spock in this episode. I mean, he is not, even though he's presented as humorless, he often, pokes at Bones, and he often, seems, kind of amused by the discomfort experienced by Kirk. While he's presented as emotionless, we get it in this episode that he's not. I'm going to step out of the timeline for a second. One of the most famous lines of Spock, both from the TV shows and the movies, is the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. For some reason in this one, he chooses the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the one. And that's a level of humanity that's more than half human, it seems to me. And so logically, it doesn't work, but yes, I think it works. What about you?
Okay. Well, I'm going to go a little further than you did. I think that this show stands up really well just as a production, because here's the thing. I guess I'm putting on my producer hat for this. I'm looking at it from a production standpoint, and I go, you know what? Of all the lousy clip shows that have ever been made, every sitcom gets to that point where they have to bust out the clip show. I think this is the granddaddy of them all, and this does it better than probably any other clip show possibly has done it.
Well, if this were actually a clip show, I'd agree with you, but this is more like a Russian nesting doll of a TV show, right?
Right.
I mean, you've got this show, but then you open it up, oh, look, there's another show.
Yeah, right. So I think it's done very well, and I think the drama is good and solid, and I think it does give us a lot to ponder about Spock. Now, we may go nuts if we try to ponder that to the point of, well, how well does this fit in with the rest of Spock that we know? But we really are driving home that that core of humanity that he has, that he will go that far for his friend. And again, we don't want to step out of the timeline too much, but that has big payoff later on, So I think that's really interesting stuff to ponder about Spock. And I think that just seeing the alternate Enterprise here, Pike's Enterprise, is fascinating for a fan. I do agree with you. I think that's a great idea to watch season 1 and then watch this at the end of season 1. Then go into season 2, just because you kind of want to get the other stuff out of the way, and then you get to sit down for this kind of heavy, dramatic courtroom drama with all the other stuff about Pike.
It's also just not a bad idea to give yourself a little distance. Because seriously, you have just watched most of these 2 episodes about 9 or 10 episodes ago.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right. So, but this is the toughest question, though. Does this have a message?
Not one that works exactly. I mean, again, it goes back to the whole logic thing. I'm okay with it not having a message, though. I mean, you can say that loyalty to friends and loved ones is always rewarded, except I don't think that that's necessarily the case. You could make the case that is the message, but I don't know that message is always true. And I don't know that would necessarily be a message to live up to. Just because you can think of some really extreme instances where, you stay loyal to someone and, knowing that what they're doing is awful, and you end up in as much trouble, if not more, than they're in. So if we decided that was the message, then I don't feel like it would work out. But I don't really think this is an episode with a message. I think this is honestly more character study. For all 3 of them, for Bones, Kirk, and Spock, certainly mostly for Spock, but examining how their characters interact as well, to a smaller degree, I think.
This whole plan could have gone horribly wrong.
Yes, indeed.
Horribly wrong. And loyalty is an admirable trait in people. You want loyalty from your friends. And you want to be loyal to your friends because that does. It benefits you. It benefits your friends. It benefits the way that kind of our social interactions in our society is built.
Right. But
you have to inject a certain amount of logic and transparency in that, or else you can run this huge risk of, well, in this case, death. But maybe that's not the thing we're looking out for in real life. But certainly you run this risk of having all of that backfire horrifically. So it's tough to find a message here. I think, again, this is one of those episodes where we're presented with things to ponder. And from a character point of view, you get some great, rich moments out of this.
Yeah.
And I like seeing Kirk's sort of struggle. Do I trust my friend or do I not? We know that he's going to, but we like to see him kind of squirm with that for a little bit. And we like seeing McCoy kind of blow up at that a few times. But yeah, I'm not really finding a message here, which unfortunately, if we ask the question, well, does the message hold up? Well, we can't really say that it holds up if there's not really a solid message to hang your hat on with this one.
Right. But I mean, as you said, the production does hold up.
Yeah, I do think it does. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool as I think you are, John, you're not the end-all be-all, and neither am I. Maybe somebody out there heard a message that we missed in the Menagerie. If you did, please send it to us. We would love to hear from you. You can hit us up on our Facebook page. You can contact us on Twitter at MissionLogPod is our name there, at MissionLogPod. You can leave us a message on Skype. MissionLogPod is the name on Skype. Or you can call us, 323-522-5641. Your comments may be used on a future edition of the Mission Log.
Next week's mission, Kirk narrowly escapes murder at the hands of an actor in The Conscience of the King.
Some of the music for the Mission Log provided by Warp 11, online at warp11.com, and from the album Messages by Key Theory, free to download at kitheory.com. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go arrange an episode of Mission Log that features the host listening to an episode of Mission Log. Should be trippy. And transmission.
Now leaving Nerdist.com.